As just noted, this program is recorded, so if you leave early or there may be some folks joining late, we will be sending out a link to the recording a day or two after tonight for those everyone to enjoy. For those who are new to OLLI, we are a lifelong learning community of over 1,400 older adults in the Berkshires and beyond, and one of a network of 125 OLLIs throughout the United States, from Hawaii to Maine. So those who are joining us from other OLLIs, a special welcome. OLLI at BCC offers 5 semesters of classes each year, both online and in person, with no tests, no grades, and no prerequisites, just learning for the love of learning. For more information, you can visit our website at berkshireolli.org. We are delighted to partner with One Berkshire and the Berkshire Innovation Center in the Tech Impact Forum, which presents fascinating talks, courses, and more exploring the future of technology and how it impacts us locally and around the world. Tonight, depends what time it is, but I am delighted to now introduce Ben Sosney, who is the Executive Director of the Berkshire Innovation Center, who will introduce our speakers tonight. Ben?
Thank you, Megan, and really appreciate all your efforts and all your organization has done over the past couple of years with us. The Berkshire Innovation Center is an independent nonprofit in Pittsfield that works very closely with advanced manufacturing and other technology-enabled companies in the Berkshires, helping us break down barriers and fuel economic development. We also operate a 23,000 square foot R&D facility, and join with partners on programming like this. As Megan said, the Tech Impact Forum is the joint initiative between OLLI, One Berkshire, and the BIC, and we're really looking at understanding emerging technologies, big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, all these things that are having a major impact on the nature of work and education and training. This is the first of a series we're planning focused on climate change and some of the technologies that have or are emerging as we transition to cleaner sources of energy. Prior to running the Innovation Center, I was an attorney practicing in Brooklyn, and prior to that, I was a law student studying environmental law and in clean energy. And one of my mentors during that process was Michael Berger, who at that time was a professor at Roger Williams. Michael has since moved on in his career and is now the executive director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia University. He leads a dynamic team that is really at the forefront of domestic and international efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and promote climate change adaptation through pollution control, resource management, land use planning, and green finance. He's been involved in collaborations with local and national environmental groups, large government organizations, and international organizations, including the UN and the International Red Cross. He is a widely published scholar, a frequent speaker at conferences and symposiums, and a regular source on media outlets. We are really, really grateful for his appearance here. So thank you very much, Michael. We're also joined locally by one of our real leaders in the region. Tanja Srebotnjak is the director of the Zilkha Center for Environmental Initiatives at Williams College. She's worked on sustainability since 2000 in a variety of settings, including also at the United Nations, at the National Resource Defense Council, in environmental think tank, in academia, and in K-12 schools. So Tanya, Michael, I want to stop talking and give you the floor. They are here to see you. So thank you again, and really, really appreciate you joining us today. So Michael.
Great, thank you so much, Ben. And it's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to talking to folks for a little bit, then turning it over to Tanya, and then I think there'll be some time for Q&A following our two presentations. So yes, the subject of my talk will be on climate change risks and opportunities. If there is anything that is changing the nature of work and the nature of business in the world, in the nation, in the region, in your town right now, climate change has got to be on that list. So if you can go to the next slide, Ben, and I do apologize for my inability to share my screen and avoid the directives, but we can all put up with that. So what are we looking at with climate change? In the last 140 years, and especially in the years since World War II, we have seen a dramatic increase in global concentrations of atmospheric carbon dioxide. At the same time, and moving nearly in lockstep, we have seen an increase in average global temperatures. This phenomenon, well known as global warming, has resulted in current temperatures of about 2 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial averages. Next slide. This temperature has already put us outside the range of anything ever experienced by human beings. Staying within 2 degrees Celsius of global warming, the internationally agreed upon outside limit, is far outside the norm, and 4 degrees Celsius, which we would reach within this century if we do not change course, is literally off the charts. Next slide, please. So this global warming has led to dramatic changes in our global climatic system. For instance, the maximum winter sea ice extent in the Arctic has decreased dramatically over the last 2 decades. That is to say, there is less ice in the thick of winter in the Arctic. Next slide. Similarly, the sea ice minimum in the Arctic has shrunk. So there's also less ice in the summertime. Next slide. These global changes appear in a number of key areas: food, water, ecosystems, and extreme weather events. As temperatures increase over the course of time, the impacts we are already seeing will increase, meaning that they will get worse. And eventually, each of these things, whether it be failing crop yields in various regions, the disappearance of glaciers, significant decreases of water availability in large parts of the world, sea level rise threatening major metropolitan areas, or whether it be the loss of our coral reef systems and eventually the extinction of mass numbers of species, or a regularity of occurrence of extreme events that is just kind of unthinkable right now. As we move further and further out in time and temperatures increase, we eventually do run the risk of reaching a tipping point where the climate becomes fundamentally unrecognizable to us, and we have no idea what might happen next. Next slide, please. So what kind of risks more particularly are we looking at? Well, on one end of the spectrum are slow onset risks, and these can include things like existential risk, which exists for small island states in the Pacific Ocean and low-lying areas in large parts of the developing world. Next slide. And then one step in from that very dramatic outcome are other slow onset risks leading to gradual degradation of land and habitats. Next slide. One issue which may not seem prevalent here in Western Massachusetts, or I should say there in Western Massachusetts, is drought and desertification. But even still, this type of change, which you might think of as changes in water availability, changes in soils and soil types and soil aridity, and the flora and the survivability of flora and the types of flora that inhabit an area are already impacting agriculture in the Northeast region of the United States. Next slide. Then there are also disaster risks, which are more familiar to our area as they are to places all around the world. These particular pictures are from Chile, but they may as well be from California, Colorado, Montana, Massachusetts, or elsewhere. Extreme storms leading to flash floods and inundation are something that people in Massachusetts are certainly familiar with. The potential for wildfire is more prevalent, obviously, in other parts of the country and the world, but both of these sudden extreme event risks are increasingly prevalent in the United States and elsewhere. Next slide. Taken together, these various climatic changes also pose what are called cross-cutting risks. And this can include risks to things like food security and poverty alleviation. among the Sustainable Development Goals worldwide and here in the United States, is to address just those concerns. Next slide, please. So to address these concerns, the international community in 2015 signed the Paris Agreement, committing to limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures and using best efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees. So I'll talk about those 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees because that's the climate change sort of denominations, but you can roughly double those and get the degrees in Fahrenheit if that's more useful. So the Paris Agreement takes a bottom-up approach, relying on nationally determined contributions to set the goals for individual countries to reduce their emissions. We are far from reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement. As you see on this slide, the current emissions, the policies that are actually in place will put us on a trajectory to roughly 3 degrees centigrade by the end of this century. And that's another time frame that you'll hear talked a lot about in climate change parlance. And I'll talk about a few different ones: 2030, 2050, and 2100. Here you see emissions curves leading out towards the end of the century. So our current policies put us on a track roughly towards 3 degrees C. The pledges that have been put into place under the Paris Agreement, those nationally determined contributions, lop off about ½ degree centigrade. The optimistic take on net zero targets that have been pledged by subnational governments, corporations, and national governments, which is to say net zero emissions by 2050 or something like that, put us on a track to 2 degree. And then you have the much more dramatic reductions that are needed to achieve really an emissions trajectory consistent with 2 degrees or better yet 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. Next slide, please. And more immediately, I guess, more importantly, this slide shows what needs to happen in the very near term, in the next 10 years and in the next 30 years in order to be on track for a non-climate catastrophic future. As you can see here, we need to make dramatic reductions between now and 2030 in order to be on a realistic pathway towards a 2 degree or 1.5 degree scenario. Next slide. Only one country in the world right now has policies in place that are considered consistent with that 1.5 degree scenario, and that's the Gambia, which is not a major contributor to climate change worldwide. A number of countries are almost sufficient. Many are insufficient, and most are either highly insufficient or critically insufficient. So we are way off track on a global basis to meet this moment. Next slide, please. Now, turning a bit to what this means for business development, for innovation, for regional economic development, and for individual companies. The reality of climate change impacts and the need to adapt to climate change impacts and the need to transition our economy in a way that's consistent with these low emission and ultimately zero emission scenarios raises a number of different risks for companies and for business. These include regulatory risk, litigation risk, reputation risk, transition risk, and opportunity, as well as impacts risk and opportunity. I'll talk a little bit more about each of these. Next slide, please. So with regulatory risk, we're really talking about two different things. On the one hand, we're talking about the current laws and regulations, those that are already on the books or that we might see, those that are already on the books. And these include laws relating to GHG emissions, that is greenhouse gas emissions, the regulation of natural resources management, in particular fossil fuel extraction, transportation, and combustion, energy efficiency standards for a wide range of appliances and vehicles, and then securities laws and blue sky laws around disclosure. Next slide. But we're also looking at what's going to happen next and the risk that regulations will be put into place that will change the regulatory environment for businesses that are operating. This could include anything. And if you follow climate news these days, there's a lot on the table with the infrastructure bill and with the reconciliation bill at the national level. And there's a lot on the table in a lot of state legislatures. These can include things like the carbon tax, a direct tax on carbon emissions, direct emissions limits on emitters, whether they be power plants, industrial operations, or smaller emitters, such as large buildings in cities, cap and trade programs that allow companies to and asset owners to trade the emissions credits among those that are regulated. An outright ban on the use of fossil fuels is something that some people are pushing for. Energy efficiency standards, which again can ratchet up the ambition and ratchet up the requirements that are imposed on a wide range of commercial and residential appliances. And then process or product standards, which may reach those kind of life cycle emissions or embedded emissions in a range of products. Next slide. Litigation risk, another form of risk. So along with the reality of climate change and the need to adapt to it and to its transition comes a greater awareness of these things. One part of litigation risk that individual companies might face is the risk that they fail to disclose information relevant to their knowledge of the risks that climate change poses. And that can relate to either physical risk or it can relate to transition or litigation risk. Talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Next slide, please. Litigation risk also relates very particularly to the risk that there will be third-party actions or lawsuits filed against individual types of companies. And these in the climate change space can fall into two categories: the failure to mitigate or the failure to adapt. The failure to mitigate meaning the failure to reduce emissions. And these types of lawsuits can roughly be thought of as falling into two categories. Those are seeking to enjoin businesses from particular activities that contribute to the climate problem, and those that seek compensation for damages that result from climate change. Similarly, with the failure to adapt, the failure of asset owners to adapt their infrastructure or their businesses to climate change can face similar sorts of lawsuits. Next slide. So I apologize that for some reason this slide got messed up in translation, but this is a slide that shows the lawsuits that have been filed over the last 4 years by state and local governments against fossil fuel companies, seeking compensation for climate change damages and the costs of adaptation, or else seeking to impose, to find the companies liable for misleading consumers based on their deceptive marketing about the climate change impacts of their products. And I'm sorry that you can't really see it, but the basic idea of these lawsuits, and in the interest of full disclosure, I'll note that I do work with the law firm that represents many of the plaintiffs in these cases, so works with the governments that are bringing these lawsuits. The basic idea of these lawsuits is one of two things. Either they're lawsuits that claim that the fossil fuel companies have deceptively marketed their products to consumers and should be held liable under state consumer fraud statutes, or they're lawsuits brought under state common law, nuisance, negligence, failure to warn, design defect, some kind of common law tort that seeks to hold these companies accountable for the costs of adaptation based on their contribution to the problem of climate change, based on the historic disinformation campaign that these companies have been involved in for the last 30 years concerning the nature of the climate crisis. Next slide. A different type of litigation, but it's one particularly relevant to the New England region because the Conservation Law Foundation, an environmental group that operates in New England, has been at the forefront of bringing these types of lawsuits. Isn't about the contributions to climate change, but rather about the failure to adapt to those climate change impacts that we talked about a little bit before. So these are lawsuits that, again, are brought against fossil fuel companies, but these lawsuits allege that these companies have failed to adapt their coastal infrastructure. So these involve terminals in the Port of Providence, at the Everett terminal south of Boston, and down in New Haven to sea level rise risk and the risk of extreme events leading to flooding of their coastal fossil fuel terminals. They're Clean Water Act lawsuits, Resource Conservation Recovery Act lawsuits. They're using existing environmental laws to seek to force these companies to adapt their infrastructure to the realities of climate change impacts. Next slide. And then finally on the litigation risk, and I've just got to talk about all litigation because I'm a lawyer and I study this stuff and it's interesting to me, are negligence lawsuits. And in California, inverse condemnation lawsuits. And these are lawsuits that can be brought and have been brought against companies that have failed to adapt their infrastructure to climate change risks that has led to adverse environmental impacts, such as the wildfires in California. And so rather than seeking to force them to adapt, which is the Conservation Law Foundation lawsuits, they're seeking compensation for the damages. Ultimately, this lawsuit against PG&E in California, this large set of lawsuits against PG&E in California, forced the utility to go bankrupt and move through the bankruptcy process. And it has now emerged from that with a new system in place. Next slide, please. So ultimately, what we're looking at are a number of transition risks as well as opportunities. So climate change will impact a variety of types of business prospects. It will also present new business opportunities. And for some, particularly the fossil fuel industry and those that service it, it may also represent the risk of stranded assets. That is to say, large assets that are owned but can't ultimately be used because of the need to not burn fossil fuels. Next slide, please. So just to sort of recapitulate a little bit, what are the risks? What are the impacts that are behind the risk and opportunity? Changing weather patterns, sea level rise, shifts in species distribution, changes in water availability, changes in temperature, variation in agricultural yield and growing seasons. All of these climate impacts can create new risks and new opportunities for companies and for regional economies to adapt. These also include impacts on infrastructure and real property, impacts on supply chains, impacts on operations, and impacts on demands for services and products. Next slide, please. So in the last segment here, I want to talk a bit about how we're going to accomplish the energy transition and the economic transition that's already underway to address the climate crisis. There are three pillars of what's sometimes referred to as deep decarbonization, the need to remove carbon from our economy. Step one, increase energy efficiency of existing appliances and operations to the maximum extent possible. We want to get as much as we can from as little energy as we can, as much operation, as much power, as much work from as little as we can. Then we've got to decarbonize the electricity supply because we ultimately have to electrify everything. And so you have to remove the carbon from the electricity supply by ramping up the supply of renewable energy. This also involves the end use fuel switching to electric sources. So we've got to get transportation as well as our power sector off of fossil fuels and onto electricity that is powered by renewable energy. Next slide, please. If you look here, you'll see that the technology that's going to contribute ultimately to this energy transition is relatively well known. And the big pieces of this have been and will be increases in energy efficiency and increases in the supply of renewable energy. Fuel switching will make a difference. Nuclear power may or may not make a difference depending on policies. And carbon capture and sequestration, which remains a very nascent technology, may also be something that contributes ultimately in significant ways to our climate future. Next slide. Now, ultimately, we have to look at this on a global scale. And as you can see on this picture, which you may have seen in any number of contexts before, the vast majority of energy is consumed in the global north, and the vast majority of darkness at night exists in the global south. And most of this all happens along the coasts everywhere. Next slide, please. What's projected over the next 30 years, however, is that there will be a large increase in world energy use between now and mid-century. And that large increase is going to be led by growth in Asia. There will also be growth in the Middle East and in Africa, and some in the Americas, but we're really looking at a large increase of energy use in the developing world, in the global south. Next slide. That energy use necessarily has to involve a rampant and large increase in the amount of renewable energy. And what you can see on this slide is that the projections call for renewable energy between now and mid-century to be the primary growth area in energy worldwide. Next slide. And within renewable energy, it's wind and solar that have dominated and will continue to dominate growth in that sector. So you can see that represented in two different ways on these slides, but one way or the other, wind and solar are eating up more and more of the energy supply charts. Next slide. This is a little difficult to read, obviously, on your screen, but the basic idea here is that this is a chart showing the levelized cost of energy production. And once you remove these subsidies that are in place that favor one energy supply system over another, and what you can see here is that industrial scale solar and industrial scale wind is cheaper than fossil fuels. That is, it's cheaper than gas peaking, it's cheaper than coal. It's highly competitive or cheaper than natural gas combined cycle power. So once you remove the policies in place that favor the existing fossil fuel power infrastructure that we have, you'll see that it's actually cheaper for consumers, more affordable if we move to utility scale renewables now. Next slide. What this means is that, so over the last decade, between 2010 and 2019, we saw rampant growth and investments in renewable energy worldwide. Most of this was put into wind and solar. Next slide. This also has salience ultimately for the New England region and for Massachusetts and for Western Massachusetts, right? All of the states in New England have some form of greenhouse gas emissions goal at this point. And these are all, so the 80 by 50 is either legislatively mandated as it is, and this is maybe a little bit out of date actually now that I see it, or it's an aspirational goal as it is in New Hampshire. Next slide, please. There are also state renewable portfolio standards that are in place that require an increase in the amount of renewable energy that is being put onto the grid. And you can see here that over the next 20 years, that percentage has to increase in every state, and hopefully will increase in New Hampshire. Next slide. And this has led to an increase in the number of proposed, planned, and projected renewable capacity for compliance with these statewide goals. And again, this is just another representation to show that we're going to be looking at more solar and wind. And in particular, what you can see here is that over the next 10 years, there's a projected vast increase in the amount of utility scale wind that will be provided in New England. Next slide, please. Here again is just a slide showing right now where there are planned renewable energy projects in New England. A good number of solar projects are already sort of in the works. This means, again, that to fulfill the goals of the RPS of the state legislated mandates, and in order to get to be consistent with what's projected, we're also going to see, again, a large increase in the number of wind projects that probably start cropping up around the region. Next slide, please. So this slide gets a little bit busy, and I'm running short on time, or I'm running over the time that I had hoped to take, I guess I should say. There are an increasing number of wind proposals offshore, and we're starting to see some onshore as well. And so you can see that that this is happening throughout the region, consistent with what I've been saying all along. Wind and solar cropping up around the region. Next slide, please. So this is the final slide, and it just adds in another couple of important points, which is I've been talking about wind and solar, but that's not all there is. Battery storage and energy efficiency are going to be important. Energy efficiency for the reasons that I mentioned at the outset. This is a critical part of any pathway to deep decarbonization, and battery storage ultimately to deal with the problem of intermittent availability of sun and wind. In order for a renewable energy powered economy to work, we're going to need to be able to store power for times when those resources are not available. And that's going to, it seems, likely rely on battery storage. And this is an area where technologies are rapidly developing. Capacity is beginning to develop. And between now and the end of the decade, I expect we'll see tremendous growth in battery storage capacity and availability. Next slide. So I'll stop there, and what I'll close off by saying is I know that there are plenty of people that are probably zoomed into this webinar who are far more intimately engaged in, involved with, and familiar with the intricacies of what's going on in Massachusetts in terms of the growth of renewable energy and what opportunities and risks are present when it comes to this particular sector. I'm very much looking forward to hearing more from Tanya on this, and looking forward to the Q&A that will hopefully follow. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. That was great. And I know there's a lot of great questions coming in on the chat. I'm going to pass to Tanya, and we'll get to those questions after that. So.
Sounds great. Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Megan, for hosting tonight's event. It's amazing to see such an audience from all over the country, East Coast all the way to Hawaii. And thank you, Mike, for really your very insightful remarks. Well, Mike brought us really essentially the IPCC's overview of the risks and opportunities of climate change at the international global scales, and focus a bit on what type of litigation is underway and has been used to try to compel governments and corporations into acknowledging climate change and taking prudent steps to tackle it. I want to speak to you for a few minutes a little bit more about the role of higher education institutions in this debate, and what opportunities colleges and universities can offer both to their students, but also to the communities and the larger world in which we operate. So realizing the great geographical diversity that we have in amongst our audience tonight, I do want to spend 1 minute talking about where Williams College is located. So I changed my virtual background to one of the really typical pictures that you can take just about anywhere here in the northwestern part of Massachusetts, which is a part of the Berkshires. So rolling hills, a warm, humid summer climate, and a cold winter climate. Beautiful for hiking, a rather rural part of the state. Williams College is located just a stone throw away from the Vermont border to the north, and the New York State border further to the west. So what that means for Williams College is that we have a significant role to play in the region's economic, cultural, social demographic sort of characteristics, and we are a significant change agent here for the region as well. Williams College has about 2,000 undergraduate students, about 400 faculty, and about 1,800 staff that support the day-to-day operations and administration of the college. A 2008, so somewhat dated study that I found by the Center for Creative Community Development puts the economic impact of Williams College and that of Bard College at Simon's Rock, a little bit farther south from Williams College, at about $390 million per year. So it's significant for this rural part of Massachusetts. Its employment impact exceeds 4,000, and that is just the direct employment impact, not to mention obviously the jobs that are supported through the family members of our employees, through the economic contributions that our employees make here in the region. So Williams College is a significant player in the region, but also a key partner to our small town of Williamstown, population 6,000 or 7,000. And the college and the town have literally co-developed and grown together. And so if you come and have a chance to visit, you will see just how intricately the college is woven into the town's fabric. The main shopping street, business street, Spring Street, is a mixture of buildings owned by the college, owned privately, businesses that are supported by the college, independent businesses, the post office, local cultural and arts related nonprofits. All of that really is to be seen as an ecosystem. So it's no surprise that community engagement features very promptly in the college's climate action. But beyond that, our fresh off the press new strategic plan has embedded sustainability as one of two cross-cutting themes, the other being diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it outlines a truly holistic and ambitious set of sustainability goals. And I just want to highlight those that are directly related to tackling climate change. So we have committed ourselves to reduce 80% of our direct campus emissions. So that is our own combustion of fossil fuels and emissions from our vehicle fleet, as well as the emissions associated with the electricity that we purchase from the grid by 2035. So 80% reduction by 2035 compared to our 1990-91 baseline level. We have been carbon neutral since 2020. And for those of you who have heard all these different terms from net zero to carbon neutral, carbon neutrality basically means that we purchase carbon offsets for our annual greenhouse gas emissions. So we invest in projects locally and globally that avoid carbon emissions or mitigate them through, for example, afforestation, through fuel switching and investments in, for example, landfill gas capture. But we do want to become net zero. So that means that we are taking a science-based target initiative, or we follow science-based targets to drive our total emissions down to net zero by 2050. So following essentially the global plans that Mike has described that are necessary for us to keep climate change under, or global warming under 2 degrees Celsius. We want to continue to increase solar power on campus. And one way we invest quite heavily to reduce our own demand for energy is to upgrade our existing buildings, implement energy efficiency measures from LED lighting to replacing old and leaky windows, improving the insulation of our buildings, tightening the envelopes to reduce heat loss in the winter and reduce heat gain in the summer. One important aspect that's often overlooked is that it's one thing to reduce your year-over-year emissions, but we also have to look at how much carbon is embedded in our buildings and in any new buildings that we construct, and in the stuff that we buy, from toilet paper to food in the dining halls to printers, furniture. All of that stuff was made using energy that is still dependent to varying degrees on fossil fuels. So properly accounting for those emissions, which we call embodied carbon, is also a part of our strategy to overall reduce our impact or our contribution to climate change globally. We want to increase our landscape management plan to include more explicit sustainability goals, habitats for pollinators, passive shading that reduces energy demand in buildings by planting trees wisely in the right locations and using the right varieties, planting plants and trees that are especially suited for carbon capture, for sequestering carbon and putting that into biomass, for example. And obviously we want to reduce waste and promote reuse, repurpose, and recycling. I mentioned really how important it is for us to work with our community partners in Williamstown and beyond. So Williams College has active investments in our community climate fund of $100,000 per year that supports local weatherization projects, reuse and recycle projects, that provides bridge funding to small businesses and local farmers to buy equipment that is more energy efficient, to buy equipment that helps them capture greenhouse gases and otherwise makes their operation less dependent on fossil fuels. We have a home weatherization program that runs every fall, so-called Winter Blitz, and we partner with the Center for Learning and Action and our Multicultural Center, the Davis Center, to actively incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion and social justice issues in the climate work that we do on campus and off campus. I don't know how many students might be among our audience tonight, but obviously students at Williams College play a key role in acting as catalysts and advocates for stepped up efforts, but also as learners and researchers, as interns and messengers for a hopeful but also fact-based and action-oriented message on climate change. We see growing interest among students in sustainability careers. And every time, for example, a computer science or a math major approaches me and asks, what can I do in my field to have a positive impact on the environment? I say that now every job is connected to sustainability and climate change. And we'll just need to look at what it is that interests you, and we can find opportunities for you to, for example, reduce the energy intensity of servers, to use mathematical modeling to support a climate nonprofit to make more precise local predictions on what climate change adaptation could look like and what the benefits of that would be. So there's something there for everyone. We obviously have internships at the Zilkha Center. We have off-campus partnerships with other institutions and think tanks in other locations, and in Washington, D.C., soon in Germany as well. So we really hope to prepare all and every student to be environmentally literate and climate literate, so that they can be leaders and change makers in their communities and in their future careers. One other thing I do want to come back to is the link between climate change action and social and racial justice. For us, that is an ongoing important conversation. And as I mentioned, diversity, equity, inclusion is the other cross-cutting theme in our strategic plan. And we have all seen the disparities that COVID-19 has revealed regarding low-wage workers, frontline workers, communities of color. And it's no different when it comes to climate change. The most vulnerable are the ones who are already suffering the most from the impacts of climate change. That is going to continue to get worse unless we step up and direct our efforts to bring resiliency, to bring funding, to bring mitigation efforts to communities that have long shouldered a disproportionate burden of pollution, of neglect, of underinvestment. And so, at the Zilkha Center, right, we earlier this year developed our own strategic plan for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's a win-win because if we concentrate on bringing a more diverse group of students to and into the environmental field, we stand to gain a lot. We gain more insights, different perspectives, a deeper and more honest set of conversations around the role of race, of income inequality, of other socioeconomic factors and systemic disparities that are exacerbated by climate change, and that our work needs to address. So in summary, I hope that Williams College has served you tonight as a bit of a case study of what higher education institutions can do in terms of recognizing their responsibility as both contributors to climate change and as educators of future leaders in the field, and our role here in the Berkshire region as a major job creator, as a major contributor to advanced learning, to the culture, and to community action. So I end here, and I look forward to hearing your questions and posing them to Mike. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Really appreciate that overview. I'm going to just ask you one question that came up on the panel just now, and then I'll let you pose a few to Michael, and there's a bunch in the chat. So can you talk a little bit about the way Williams can share their ideas for ways to reduce emissions to people in the broader community, and how, I guess, the students and even the Alumni Network play a role in that?
Yes, one direct or one immediate project right now is that Williamstown has adopted a net zero resolution. And it is pretty clear that for the town to achieve that, and for Williams College to achieve its own climate goals, we need to work hand in hand. So to give you an example, one of the strategies we're looking at to reduce our own energy demand is to capture waste heat in the sewage system. To do that, however, we want to and we need to partner with the town in order to build the infrastructure and not work sort of cross-purpose, depending on the sort of the planning that's starting to take on shape for the town's own path towards net zero. So I think by joining forces, we can be both more effective and more cost efficient. So that's one, but I think also you mentioned the alumni, right? So through our extensive alumni network, we both, create opportunities for students to take internships, and we take feedback back from our alumni. They hold us accountable when we don't move fast enough or holistically enough, or are overlooking things in our own strategies and initiatives. So it's a wonderful partnership that that I think it's the oldest alumni society in the country that just has celebrated its 200th anniversary, that has helped guide Williams College in very many meaningful ways and benefited our students tremendously.
Great, thank you. I'm actually going to throw out one question to Michael. I'll let you regroup a second. I know you've been talking, so you can look at your notes. If you have questions for Michael, I know you prepared a few. One thought that I've had is we've all been watching over the last almost 2 years now, both the private sector and the public sector coalesce around, or at least try to, around the crisis we're currently facing with the global pandemic. Are there lessons learned? Is there an optimistic view perhaps about the way, for example, in the biotech world, there was a sharing of information in the way perhaps people around the world view the role of government and how that changed, and how sort of the cooperative approach to attacking, like the pandemic may sort of train us to attack the current global climate crisis?
Okay, so you asked for sort of the optimistic answer to that, and I'll not give you that, because since the onset of the COVID pandemic, there has been a conversation within the climate discourse community. What can we learn right off the bat? What's being learned, and what will be the impact of the pandemic on emissions? Because when we all went remote or were in lockdown, emissions decreased naturally, and with the global trade impacted, there was a decrease in emissions in some sense that maybe this would be permanent. But I think that unfortunately that was a blip, and emissions have picked up again. And I think that unfortunately the COVID pandemic has actually exposed many of the same fault lines that exist when it comes to climate change, which is to say there's a vast disparity and inequity in terms of access globally to vaccines, for instance, and to the medicines. And while there certainly was a historic, record-setting, unprecedented mobilization of financial support and incentive for technological innovation, and they came up with these vaccines in amazing speed, and now they're getting rolled out, and we're seeing the impact of that. And I do think that there's something positive in that, which goes to show that mobilization can produce the necessary technological innovation and response. The rollout itself has been highly polarized, highly politicized. So two of the things that we see front and center in climate change, we've seen with COVID as well, and they require further thinking, which is to say the inequity of the distribution of the impacts and the access to the solutions and the beneficial the benefits of those solutions on a global level, and then the highly unfortunate disinformation campaigns that surrounded the vaccine and continue to surround the vaccine, and the politicization of a public health crisis that really just ought to not be political at all. So it requires some further thinking through how to address those two problems, which are the same, moving forward.
Great. I'll add on, Mike. So I talked a bit about social and racial justice issues. How do you see them play out at the global scale? How intertwined is that that area with the work that you do and the kind of legal cases that you follow and also are probably involved with? Does social and racial justice play a role in those? And so could you elaborate a little bit more how they are intertwined?
Yeah, I mean, social, racial justice have been, I would say, far more central to policy discourse, policy conversations over the years than to litigation. And that's true in the United States, and that's true internationally for very particular legal reasons. In the United States, the Civil Rights Act does not provide a viable avenue for successful litigation around disparate impacts of environmental pollution or climate change impacts against the federal government or individual actors. So without going too deep into it, the federal statutes don't provide the best litigation pathway. There have been very innovative approaches that have been taken to filing complaints with the Environmental Protection Agency, to have administrative hearings, to a wide variety of things. We have recently seen, and I would say in the last couple of years, there have been a couple of notable decisions where social and racial justice issues, the issue of environmental justice and how it's treated under environmental impact assessment and how it's treated under state and local review of zoning decisions and that kind of thing, the need to address, at least assess and disclose what is known about those disparate impacts and about the racial aspect of environmental and climate decision making is starting to make a little bit of headway in the courts. And so I think that that's something that we are beginning to see. Globally, I think that the most obvious way that one would see sort of the global north, global south divide, which is a racial divide as well as a geographical divide, of course, come front and center in international litigation, would be something like a lawsuit against the United States brought by a small island state in the Pacific region, or an African nation, or somewhere else, to the International Court of Justice in The Hague. And just now, there is another movement, and this has happened in the past. There is a movement being led by Vanuatu, the island state of Vanuatu, to have the United Nations General Assembly pass a resolution requesting an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice in The Hague on the obligations of states to combat the climate crisis in order to protect future generations. Now, that's not something that necessarily head-on addresses racial justice, but it's deeply embedded in the question, because the impacts on future generations, as far as we understand them, will be disparate, and they will break out along racial fault lines, as well as geographical fault lines, as well as economic fault lines. So that's a partial answer to a very complicated and quite large question.
I'm going to stick with large, complex questions, taking one here from the audience. And audience, I am scrolling through the chat, hoping to touch on a variety of questions that you post. If I miss yours, please feel free to post it again, put it straight in front of my eyes, so to speak. But here, my one panelist says, there's still considerable political and corporate resistance to addressing climate change. Where do you see the main barriers, and what do you consider to be the best ways to address and overcome the political, unwillingness to address climate issues and to implement meaningful solutions?
Yeah, it's interesting. I always have a sort of innate reaction against the idea that there's a political problem, because in fact, in the United States and elsewhere, there's broad support for action on climate change. So the people, the voters, do support climate action by and large. It's certainly a majority do at this point in time. What resists climate action at the national level and at the state level is our entrenched interests. And the most important entrenched interests in opposing climate action are the fossil fuel companies. So I hate to be overly simplistic about it, but for the purposes of a webinar, I think it's perfectly justifiable to say that fossil fuel money funds disinformation campaigns, or has funded disinformation campaigns, and continues to fund lobbying activity and other political activity that is directly opposed to ambitious climate action consistent with what's needed to combat the climate crisis. So I think power is really the issue, less than politics. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And in terms of using the legal apparatus and institutions here in the United States, Catherine Kidd asks, what kind of litigation has had the most effective impact on positive changes in corporate behavior on climate change?
So that's a great question. I don't know that there's a great answer as of yet to what has forced corporate action on climate change, because I think that there's still a bit of a lag until we get the real results on that. But I'll talk about a few cases internationally and domestically, as well as lawsuits against the governments, because I think that that's also something that warrants a lot of action. The vast majority of climate litigation in the United States and worldwide is not focused on corporate interests, but is focused on governments, enforcing government action. And it happens under a wide range of statutes. In the United States, the biggest sort of buckets of climate litigation are under the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, and the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, which imposes environmental impact assessment requirements. So we're really looking at a state of affairs where there are a few cases that directly go after the fossil fuel companies, that directly go after asset or infrastructure owners who have highly vulnerable property, or that go after national governments, like the Juliana case here in the United States that was brought by youth plaintiffs, all under 21 at the time the case was filed, saying that the government is failing its people by taking inadequate action on climate change. But most climate litigation takes place under a range of other statutes and existing laws. That said, there was a decision just a couple of months ago now in the Netherlands. A lawsuit was brought against Shell, the Dutch oil company, that alleged that the company under that country's law had what's called a duty of care, that they had an obligation under that nation's law to the people of the Netherlands to reduce the emissions associated with their products. That is to say, the emissions from combustion of the fossil fuels by consumers, not just their own emissions from extracting and producing it, but their so-called scope 3 emissions. And they said that they had to, under this duty of care, reduce their emissions by 2030. And the court, and it's a lower court in the Netherlands, and the decision is subject to appeal, and we will see what happens next. But the court did issue a decision saying that under that nation's law, Shell had to reduce its emissions 40% or 35% by the year, 45% by the year 2030, which is a significant decision. It's the first decision on record directly requiring a fossil fuel company to basically reduce the amount of fossil fuels it sells, because there is no other way that we know of at this point in time that could achieve a result like that. There are a number of lawsuits here in the United States that have been filed directly against the fossil fuel companies that I think have had a big influence on the dialogue and on public awareness. None of the decisions are quite final yet, so they haven't changed corporate behavior, but these are lawsuits that have been brought by states and local governments against the fossil fuel companies seeking compensation for climate change. So those lawsuits that I mentioned, and the Massachusetts Attorney General did bring one of these lawsuits under the state's Consumer Fraud Act and is currently litigating that action. These are lawsuits that really frame climate change in relationship to this historic campaign of deceptive marketing, climate denialism and climate skepticism in a sort of long-standing effort to forestall climate regulation that has been highly successful and continues to be successful. So that's a lawsuit those are lawsuits that are not done, but I think that they are having impact. And that's often the case with strategic litigation. And I'll close this answer just by referring to strategic litigation in reference to the youth lawsuits. So the Juliana case that some of you may have heard of, this lawsuit filed by 21 youth plaintiffs against the US government that is still ongoing, but is at a different stage, is not the only instance of a youth lawsuit. There have been youth lawsuits brought in states around the United States, and there are youth lawsuits that have been brought in countries around the world. And these are lawsuits where kids are going to court and saying that the national government has an obligation to reduce emissions, to combat the climate crisis in order to protect their rights and the rights of future generations that they stand in for. And I think that along with, I did note that there was a question about Greta Thunberg in the chat, that the Fridays for the Future, the youth movement, I think has been enormously powerful in shifting people's awareness, people's concern, the way people think, feel, and understand the climate crisis. And litigation has been a vital part of that youth-led movement.
I'm going to ask one more legal question, and then I'm going to shift to a couple of questions regarding the transition path itself, which you also spoke to. So one question was about, the ability of corporations to evade accountability by declaring bankruptcy, citing the PG&E case in particular. Is that, in your opinion, a strategy that corporations, utilities will take? How do you hold them accountable once they declare bankruptcy under chapter, 11 or 13? I don't know which one applies to business, but how can people still get paid damages if that filing occurs?
Well, so in the instance of PG&E, the plaintiffs who had filed lawsuits, there was a fund that was created, and so there was some access to redress under that fund. I think that this is a little bit in the weeds, probably for this audience, to get into the intricacies of bankruptcy law, and I'm not a bankruptcy lawyer, but generally speaking, when a lawsuit is filed, those claims may survive. They won't necessarily have a high rank in the order of creditors who are lining up to get money from a company that's declared bankruptcy, but they may have some role. Those claims may get wiped out. That's perfectly possible that claims filed against utilities or other potential defendants could get wiped out in a bankruptcy as the company goes through a reorganization. That's certainly possible. It wouldn't be the first time, it won't be the last time if that happens. That said, getting those claims filed, getting those cases in order the point of this is not to drive companies into bankruptcy and force them to pull tricks to reorganize and avoid liability. The point is really to, in some cases, to get redress, access to justice for cities, states, individuals who are adversely impacted by climate change and bearing the costs, and the need to try and internalize those costs to those who are responsible, or to force action from those who are most reluctant to act. Litigation is not a first choice for very many people. Litigation is a last resort, and people and other actors turn to the courts when other systems have failed.
That's great. Okay, here are two questions regarding sort of the pathway of transitioning to a low carbon or zero carbon economy in the future. How do we reasonably balance the need for energy over the next 10 years with our capacity to transition to renewable energy? If fossil fuels are cut back too fast, renewables will not be able to fill the gap. And related to that is the question of using natural gas as a bridge fuel. I think the audience member spoke of natural gas not being a fossil fuel, and how does natural gas factor into the energy transition if we will need it for some time to come?
So I think when you talk about fossil gas, which is what some people would like to call natural gas, fossil gas, because it is a fossil fuel, the question of its utility as a bridge fuel to a carbon-free future has been around for a long time. And the Obama administration fully supported the idea of natural gas as a bridge fuel. And I think that there is a legitimate range of opinions on how that's going, of the role of natural gas. And there are very well-informed views that come out in a variety of places based on policy preferences, personal views, vested interests, and beliefs, about what's going to happen. I myself am not concerned that we're going to find ourselves in a situation where we've gotten off fossil fuels and all of a sudden there's not enough wind and solar to go around. I just don't believe that our systems operators, our utility regulators, our planners are going to go that route. So it's not a realistic concern. In my mind, though, that the possibility, of course, is critical to address. And so reliability of energy supply is essential to avoiding catastrophe in and of itself. And it needs to be carefully crafted as the transition is made. Natural gas has a far lower carbon dioxide content than coal or oil, but it also has what we now know is a very high methane content. And methane is a greenhouse gas with a high global warming potential that operates on a shorter time frame than carbon dioxide. So it's also recognized, at the same time that it's recognized that natural gas can reduce carbon emissions, the need to prevent the ways in which extraction, transportation, and combustion of natural gas can lead to methane emissions is extraordinarily vital. it's now, there are recent studies showing that one of the best ways that we can achieve our climate goals is by drastically reducing methane emissions in the very short term, precisely because those methane emissions have kind of an outsized impact on near-term global warming. You know, the idea that the emissions we emit today will have an impact 100 years down the line is not consistent with current understanding. The emissions we have today, especially methane emissions and other short-acting climate pollutants, can have effects in the very near term. So we need to address that that issue.
Great, Mike. I want to give you a moment's rest, and I have a question from the audience for Ben, and that is, why hasn't the Innovation Center installed solar panels and invested in other renewable energy solutions?
Well, thank you, and that's a great one. And I will tell you, of any visitors of the Innovation Center, something I learned very quickly by working there is it is a fact that the Innovation Center is located in the absolute windiest place in the entire world. Now, I'm not sure that that's true, but it is quite a wind tunnel, and it has to do with the Taconic Mountain Range and Silver Lake. So as we have looked at it, there could be a great opportunity for small scale wind turbines there. As far as solar panels, I know that Eversource has a great large array right next to us, and we have spoken to the city of late about various projects that some of our member companies are interested in pursuing there. I wish I could say we're going to put solar panels or a turbine up in the coming months, but hopefully we do get there.
Yeah, it's an ongoing path, right? But luckily, the costs for solar, for wind, and other renewables continue to fall, making them more attractive for institutions like yours and Williams College.
We worked in a few months ago with a great local company who's a member of the BIC called Sustain, which someone from our Williams community may know, Malcolm Smith. And what he advised us, after working through both our property, our building, our energy consumption, was to access community solar, which has been fantastic. So we have entered into, I think, 3 agreements with community solar projects, which I really will credit Sustain and Malcolm for locating for us. They both reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, or at least our carbon footprint, and also reduce our bill. So he's made that program. He's reached out to all members of the Berkshire Innovation Center, offering those services to businesses. And I know it was a very simple process for us, and effective both for the bills we pay every month and for our footprint. So that's a good example of a great innovative company in the Berkshires who's helped us, and a Williams link.
Yes, great. And for members in the audience who might be interested in residential customer solutions and who live in Massachusetts, the Mass Save program offers a variety of fairly substantial rebates and incentives to insulate your home better, to help pay for energy conservation measures, and to also help, for example, install rooftop solar or geothermal, so ground source or air source heat pumps to shift away from fossil fuels for heating and cooling your home. So I would recommend that. And other states might have their own rebate and incentive programs. So check out, often your utility companies are required to post those and help sort of support them. So check them out for your local area utility company. There was actually a question here from Louise. I haven't heard much about geothermal lately. Any global progress in that area? Is that a question, Mike or Ben, you want to take? I can speak to geothermal here regionally.
I don't have much to say on geothermal other than to say that globally, I think people often look to Iceland as kind of the case study in how that can have an impact. And that increasingly one hears stories about geothermal in cities as a viable mechanism to provide building heating. And so I expect that we'll continue to see that innovation percolate in areas where the resource is available.
And I would just add, again, from my sort of very specific regional perspective, Williams College has just hired an engineering and design firm for its energy and carbon master plan. So that is the technical blueprint to achieve our at least 80% reduction by 2035. And geothermal is very much in the mix, as it has been for peer institutions here in the region, including places as far away as Carleton College, which is in a strongly heating dominated climate. And geothermal heat pumps have shown to be up to the task. They might not be able to deliver 100% of your heating needs on those very, very cold days that might occur a few times a year. So it helps to potentially supplement that still with a backup system, but that can be much smaller in size and can potentially be electric as well, or still rely on, let's say, a small source of fossil fuels, like natural gas. So we are going to do a feasibility study for a geothermal borehole field that would provide heating and cooling to much of our campus, using what we call low temperature hot water. So instead of sending steam around the campus, we would be sending hot water around the campus at about 120 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's great. It's very efficient, and it really reduces your emissions. One question, actually I have two questions here. Where did they go? I just got a whole bunch of, from Dina Fisher. Could someone address the view that these are all great programs with lots of goodwill from good people, but we are still rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic? And related to that, another member of the audience pointed out that even if the US and say Europe decarbonizes, completely, India and China are still heavily investing in new coal-fired power plants. So global emissions would continue to rise. So what is your take on those, global trajectories and what we can do to shift the planetary ship in the right direction?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's amazing. This it's real. It has been real, but there's also sort of the staying power of the narrative in which the U.S. should not really worry about what it's doing because of China and India is something that obviously has been around for a long time. It led to the tanking of the Kyoto Protocol, which would have been the first globally binding emissions trading program, and which did continue, of course, without the United States. Obviously, it's true that China is now the world's largest emitter on an annual basis. The United States remains the world's largest emitter by a far margin when it comes to historic emissions, roughly double China or something, I believe, the last I checked. China recently announced, I think in just last week, that they are no longer going to finance new coal-fired power plants, which had been a big concern about their international financing as well as their domestic development. India also has, an ambitious energy transition plan in place, and they are ramping up solar development at a rapid rate. But ultimately, India's contribution to the climate change problem pales in comparison to ours. So I don't put a whole lot of credence into the idea that because other countries are developing now, whereas we are already largely developed, that we should not take the lead in finding ways to a carbon-free future. And as it is, competitively, we are already at risk of losing some of the economic opportunities that come with being out ahead of innovation when it comes to the development of the new technologies of a carbon-free economy. So on that front, I think that, yes, India and China will continue to emit, and so will we until we maybe take the first step and show that the United States is actually committed as a country to a pathway that we have, as recently as a year ago, been, profoundly uncommitted to. As far as rearranging the decks on the chairs on the deck of the Titanic, yeah, I mean, I get that. I'm sympathetic to that, and certainly when you look at things at an individual level, if you look at the individual consumer choices we're making, whether to buy this product or that product, whether to get the water pump or the heat pump or not, whether to put a solar panel up on your roof or not, it can all seem quite small scale. But when you start looking at institutions like Williams College, the Innovation Center, maybe at a smaller scale, Columbia University, where I am, large cities, state governments, the national government, when you start looking at the purchasing power of those entities, you start looking at the possibility of really making an impact on markets, and really showing the viability of technologies and the cost effectiveness in the short term or in the long term of different investments. And that's a highly important piece of finding the solution to the puzzle. Ultimately, I think that we are on pathways to a decarbonized future. The alternative is catastrophe along the lines of something we can't imagine. So I, for one, have to hold out hope that we're not going. What I think of, and now that we're getting sort of towards the end of this, and it's been a while on Zoom, my mind is sort of doing this to me. But like Waterworld, Mel Gibson's Waterworld, like those are the sorts of futures, those kind of apocalyptic futures that are that aren't so far-fetched if we really think about what a planet that is on average 8 or 10 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than this one looks like, places where people can't live, large parts of the planet that are no longer arable or inhabitable because of heat, because of lack of access to water and those sorts of things. So I have to believe that the small steps that are being taken now by individuals, by local governments, by individual institutions, and at a larger scale by some national governments will affect long-term change. It's going to be a slow dance, but hopefully we'll get there.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Tanya. Well, I know you just touched on this, Michael, but one last question to both of y'all throw out there, because you both are academics and come from very influential organizations. I did see last week, I believe, University of Minnesota, Boston University, and Harvard all announced plans to divest from the fossil fuel industry. I think that makes 1,300 schools and institutions. Columbia, I believe, is on that list. I know there was a recent article in the Williams Record pushing Williams onto that list. I guess, Tanya, first off, do you think Williams will get there? And second, do you think, I know we talked about power and the role of power in the fossil fuel industry. Can this gain momentum to make an impact, not just if it's our major institutions, but other organizations?
Yeah, so it's really an important question. And let me first sort of speak more for Williams College, and then I speak from my vantage point as the director of the sustainability office on campus. So Williams College takes the position that number one, the college doesn't hold any direct stock in fossil fuels. It has exposure through externally managed funds and investment vehicles that contain fossil fuels. It's about 3% of the total endowment, and the college so far is sort of trying to balance the. If we were to divest from those immediately, there would be significant financial repercussions for the college, because these are long-term commitments, and they would entail tax implications and those severed relationships and the cost of getting out of them, which is seen as not being well aligned with fiduciary responsibility to the mission and of the college and its long-term viability. But that said, the college has since 2015 taken the step to actively invest in funds that promote renewable technologies and investments in low carbon type of assets. That commitment continues with new investments being slated. At the same time, the college is seeking to get out of these legacy investments representing those 3% of investment vehicles that are tied to fossil fuels. So the college is not going to make a big statement about that. It's going to happen, because it's really seen as we don't want to be seen as greenwashing, because the endowment is fairly significant, and we want to think of the endowment as more as like, can we move towards net zero in our endowment? My personal opinion is, yes, these are all steps in the right direction. I would ideally like to include ESG type environmental, social and governance criteria into the investment policy, so that it helps shape any sort of investment decisions that are being made from now on going forward. And I think that students in particular have a very important role to play in, consistently and continuously nudging the college to hold itself to the highest possible standard with regards to those social and environmental commitments that I think are pretty much common sense. It's a process, but I think we are on the right track, but it's not a very fast process.
So on divestment, I think that an individual investor, even a large institutional investor's decision to divest is highly unlikely or simply not going to have an effect on the stock price or on the company's performance or on the company's reputation. But taken together, the Divest Now movement has had an effect on possibly all of those. I don't know about the stock price, but certainly on reputation. And I think that idea of social license is critical to think about in thinking about the various strategies that are being employed and have been employed and will be employed to combat the vested interests in the carbon fueled economy. Companies operate by virtue of having a social license to operate. And when that social license is retracted, companies find it much more difficult. They find it more difficult to finance. They find it more difficult to get projects approved. They meet much more opposition on all fronts. And I see the divestment movement as, in addition to seeking to directly influence corporate decision-making, as a way of trying to influence the sense or the notion of whether these companies actually do have a social license to operate, with the answer being possibly not. The other thing I would note is that, I walked through a number of slides that talk about transition risk and physical risk, and a variety of risks to companies. And the companies most vulnerable to transition risk, of course, are the fossil fuel companies who are the subject of the divestment movement. And if you look at performance over the last decade or so, you'll see that the S&P has decreased. The percentage of the S&P that consists of fossil fuel and energy companies has decreased dramatically. And you'll see that the stock market has grossly outperformed ExxonMobil in particular and other fossil fuel companies as well. So it's a good question. The question used to be that investment managers, those that the Williams and Columbia and others who are considering this had to think about was, do we have a fiduciary duty to invest in fossil fuel companies because they are such strong economic performers? I think that the question now and over the long run is the opposite. Do I have a fiduciary duty to divest because these companies are simply too vulnerable to transition risk?
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Tanya. It is 6:30. You guys were fabulous. I really, really appreciate your time. And thank you to the audience for such engaged questions. This is obviously such an important issue for our times, our children's, etc. We're going to continue this conversation on October 26th with some representatives from Mass Clean Energy Center. They'll talk a little bit more about what Massachusetts is doing to meet their goals and to meet our goals around the net zero grid, the built environment, clean transportation, offshore wind energy, etc. More information will go out on through the BIC, through the OLLI Network, and One Berkshire on that panel. But for now, I want to say good night and thank you. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Tanya. And Megan and the OLLI team. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks. Everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, audience. Have a good night.
Take care, everyone.